Okay. Should we say our names, Taina?
Well, we certainly can.
Okay. So
It's Taina.
you're Taina and I'm Katya. And today I'm just so honored to speak with you and to have this conversation about planets and elements of astrology that have been viewed in a negative light in the past. So, I guess I'll start with the sort of idea or the premise that astrology evolves as we evolve, right? As humans evolve. And in the past, if you look back historically, there's really been a kind of attachment and aversion relationship to certain elements of astrology, including planets and certain aspects and transits, so that if someone had, Saturn transiting a powerful place in their chart, it might be like, ooh, watch out for that. Or, on the other hand, what we call benefics, right? So, Jupiter transiting would be a good thing, something to look forward to. And then, the planets that we, the word malefic, for instance, that we would cower. It's not a very empowered place. So now I would say, and I don't know if you would agree, Taina, but that we're moving in a more integral direction, just as the human race. And as we do so, my question that I'm holding has been, how can we also take a more integral approach to astrology? And perhaps, and my hope is, a more empowered and empowering approach as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because astrology really was, in my understanding of it, it's always been meant to empower. And we've culturally gone through several centuries where on massive levels all across the board, everybody was disempowered about all kinds of things. Mm-hmm. People have been in this illusion that we're victims to circumstance. And so that perspective has warped astrology. So people would look at life as, what, I don't have any control and I'm hoping for goodies and I'm dreading bad stuff. Destruction will come. I'm hoping it's not going to come today. I hope some goodies will come. Yes. I don't really have a whole lot of control or power when it comes to all of that. So when you were talking about Saturn, it made me think immediately of a recent client I was talking to had been looking at the Vedic or the Jyotish astrology and was talking about a particular, there's a name for it that, my knowledge of Jyotish is still developing, so I forget the name, but it has to do with when Saturn is transiting the house before your moon is in, the house that your moon is in, and the house after your moon is in, and that's considered to be a really difficult period, that entire time period. So this is a long stretch. And there's an enormous amount of positive stuff in the Vedic tradition, but again, it has suffered not from a lack of a spiritual perspective, which Western astrology suffered from, but from a lack of empowerment and lack of recognition that we can be the creators of our own reality. And it's gotten very somewhat superstitious and definitely fatalistic when it's misused. Both systems of astrology can be misused. So to me, I know so many people who've had Saturn going through all those houses, and myself included, no problems whatsoever. And it's interesting about Jupiter because Jupiter is a planet that every planet has its own consciousness, and every planet is wanting to help us evolve. That's the purpose of transits. That's the purpose of the planetary positions in our natal chart. And so each planet requires something of us in order to work most effectively with us. So I also remember...
just to highlight that, what you just said, that every transit, every planetary position is here to help us evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the real purpose. So if we sit in dread of it, then we're going to be, actually it's going to be counterproductive. We'd be better off without astrology.
Yes.
We're sitting in dread and we're not paying attention to the things we can learn. We're not doing positive things in our life. It's part of the reason why astrology is rejected or looked down upon, because people all think, oh my God, I looked in the ephemeris. Mercury's retrograde. I can't do anything. I can't go outside today.
Yes.
That's a whole other thing we have to probably bring into this conversation. It's actually a t-shirt I want to get, which says boycott Mercury retrograde. Because it's very interesting having done astrology for as long as I have, because having spent many years as an astrologer before the internet and noticing how things have changed since the internet in terms of people's awareness of Mercury retrograde.
Yes, right.
So Mercury retrograde, because it happens on a regular basis several times a year, it makes a really good topic for online newsletters because it's so easy. Okay, we can talk about another phase of Mercury retrograde. I can type that one out in 5 seconds. But the problem is that people are all starting to dread it now, and it's actually beginning to be a little more prevalent as far as having a bit of a challenging impact, because what's really happening is there's a mass mind belief, and
Yes.
the mass mind belief is creating circumstances.
That's fascinating. So, yeah. Well, I was just, I'll say something and then
sure,
wherever you want to go, but I just wanted to say, if we're kind of going through, if we could go through today some bullet points, some
absolutely.
of the, and like a little Mythbusters style,
Definitely.
Have fun with it. So maybe we can jump in when you're ready to Mercury retrograde.
Yeah, well, I kind of started it, so I think I'm going to just keep going with it.
Let's go. Yes, exactly.
So what happens with Mercury retrograde, generally speaking, is it is a time when the intellectual tendency is a little more introverted. So as a sort of general rule, you may not want to create a whole new event that you want lots of people to attend, because people are more likely to be going internally, be introverted. So it's less likely to be as well attended. And that's the only thing I noticed over long periods of time. Also, at the times when Mercury actually changes direction, there can be little bits of mechanical glitches, but they're very minor. And Mercury retrograde does not mean everything is doomed. There is nothing wrong with starting a new project in Mercury retrograde, because everything that begins in life, from our own lifetime to a business, it's going to have its own birth chart. And the Mercury retrograde will not damage anything, will not doom an outcome. It's not going to doom relationships. It's not going to destroy communication. Maybe tiny little mistakes are made sometimes. It's very, very, very minor. It is not something to fear. The primary purpose of Mercury retrograde is really so that we can learn how to change our mental frequency, because the mind can get rigid. The mind gets into rigid patterns. So it's kind of valuable to have subtle changes in the frequency. And right now, the collective consciousness is developing a silly little rigid pattern of fearing Mercury retrograde. So why I want that t-shirt.
Yes, that's beautiful.
But to get back to what planets require of us when they're transiting, each one, we can work most effectively with each transiting planet by having a certain perspective. So I remember speaking to a group of astrologers from the 11th House Astrology group in Ottawa, and they were all saying, well, we don't really pay attention to Jupiter transits because they don't do anything. and I found, God, I love Jupiter transits, they do great, wonderful, amazing things. However, Jupiter is a planet that expresses divine grace. So as it enters a part of our chart or a part of our lives, it sort of says, well, what would you like to do? And we can just do whatever you want. And it requires us to be trusting, and it requires us to be open. So if people are not open, then they may not, Jupiter knocks on the door and they say, no, we don't want any. And they don't consciously realize they're doing that. But the Jupiter transit can pass by and seem not to have very much impact.
Oh, what a tragedy.
I know, it definitely is. So I want to encourage people to turn to Jupiter and turn away from Mercury retrograde.
Right. And to be more engaged.
Yes.
In that way. So with Mercury retrograde, I mean, it's fascinating what you were saying about Mercury coming in and changing our mental frequency. That sounds so Mercury.
Yes.
Because Mercury is like, it seems like the thing that Mercury would dislike most is stuckness.
Yes, that's true. That's very true. Yeah.
Mm.
And it's interesting that Mercury is also the closest planet to the sun. The sun is
Mm-hmm.
the soul within our own personal birth chart, and within the solar system, it is the focus of spiritual consciousness for our entire solar system. So Mercury is very, very close to the sun, and even alchemy talks about the importance of Mercury, and Jyotish astrology looks at Mercury as the most spiritual planet, which is
Mm.
very significant. I think that's really fascinating because consciousness is the most important spiritual tool that we have. And consciousness is the goal of spiritual development. So Mercury is, in a sense, a servant of the sun. It's a servant of that spiritual consciousness. So it can be overlooked. We just think it's just the rational mind, which, yes, that's what it operates as generally in our birth chart. But there's sometimes a more subtle perspective to it.
I love that. Consciousness is the most important spiritual tool that we have. So with that, and you said that Mercury is the focus of spiritual consciousness in the...
It's the highest, it's the most spiritual planet in terms of the Jyotish. It's very
So
fascinating.
it is. And during a Mercury retrograde, what would you, in giving recommendations as we engage in an empowered way with astrology, what can we do to go along to work with the energy of Mercury changing our mental frequency?
Well, it's that you've really done a good job when you might not notice if it's gone retrograde or not.
Right.
It's not that important. But if you want to watch it, just watch what's actually going on in you. Don't get superstitious about it. But to work with it, maybe take a little bit more time to contemplate. It's contemplative time.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's most impactful when it's changing directions. So if there's going to be any little hiccups, they're going to happen when it first goes retrograde, and they'll also happen again when it first goes direct.
Right.
Now, there are more subtle interpretations which have to do with it starting to slow down before it retrogrades. It's slower when it's going direct again. So there are these little phases of the moon that are sort of fully connected to it. And people study that. I don't want to go into the detail of that.
Right.
But, to look at it in its own way, it's not too different from moon phases in terms of it being a certain sort of mood, concentration mood, attention mood. But yeah, if you're going to do something highly mechanical and complex, and it's not difficult to shift the date around, I wouldn't be doing it right when Mercury's changing direction in either going from direct to retrograde or from retrograde to direct, because that's when it's going from AC to DC or DC to AC. So we're sort of unplugging things a little bit. But again, it's a little minor issue. Okay. So my email went astray. Yeah, Mercury's changing directions. Well, I'll just send it again.
Right. Right. And to not feed that collective belief that's happening right now.
Yeah. The sky does not fall when Mercury's retrograde. It just really doesn't work that way.
I love that. Hallelujah. Thank you for that.
Now, Saturn tends to be one of those boogeymen, as far as people are concerned. And it's interesting because all astrological signs and astrological planets correspond to different keys in the tarot. And each of the 22 major arcana in the tarot all represent specific spiritual principles. Now, in tarot, the world, which is the 21st key of the tarot, so it's the final card in the deck, the world is the symbol of absolute spiritual perfection. And it's Saturn's card. It's the dancer, the world dancer, who is completely, perfectly balanced, completely integrated, a complete self that is one with the universe. So that's Saturn's goal for us. Saturn's goal for us is that beautiful, refined, perfected sense of completion. So Saturn is very ambitious as far as our evolution goes. So because Saturn believes in us, which is an interesting thing to think about, what Saturn wants from us, because Saturn wants us to move forward in a very strong, solid way and in a very complete way, Saturn would like us to pay attention to what Saturn is teaching us. So with Jupiter, we need to really trust Jupiter. And with Saturn, we need to pay attention to what is this situation showing me? What is this situation teaching me? And there is a saying in astrology that Saturn gives as much gold as it does lead, which is partly it's a metaphor from alchemy. And lead is the undeveloped, regressive part of our being that is heavy and backwards, and gold represents the spiritual perfection. And lead is also the planet connected astrologically to Saturn, and gold is the sun. So Sun and Saturn are very, very connected. Saturn is the visible planet furthest away from the sun. So in ancient times, it was the cold outside exterior of the solar system. It's the furthest reaches, again, symbolic of our highest spiritual perspective, but it was very stern. And so, but Saturn has a sense of humor. But anyways, Saturn is also stern. But Saturn is always working with the sun. They are these two polarities. And you can even see that because they rule opposite signs. The traditional ruler of Aquarius is Saturn, and the ruler of Leo is the sun. They are partners. So Saturn is really working most seriously to develop our soul. So it's the most important transiting planet when it comes to it moving through our birth chart. It's always working with us. It's always working on us. It's always that teacher. And occasionally, if we want to really face the truth, that's not going to feel very good, but it's going to be absolutely worthwhile. Yes. So I always tend to think of Jupiter and Saturn as they're the two transiting planets that are always working with us. And they're also very complementary to each other. They're also a certain polarity. And they remind me of the two types of teachers that we have when we go to school. And they're both the type of teacher you will never forget. And they're both the type of teacher who give you tremendous gifts. Because the one type of teacher is Jupiter, and that teacher is so much fun. The classroom is this wonderful free-for-all. You just enjoy it so much, and they break all the rules, but they do it joyfully, and they inspire you to do whatever you want to do, and you just flourish under Jupiter. Saturn is very strict, but really points out the most important things that you need to know. And you might in the moment feel stung by what this teacher told you, but you never forget what that teacher told you. Yeah. And you also really get any reward you get from that kind of teacher, and we always will get rewards from Saturn. It's just that Saturn wants us to get our homework done first, and then we'll get the reward. But any reward we get from that is very, very lasting. If we didn't have Saturn, we wouldn't really get much done.
So you've said also, Taina, that Saturn does make us work. You were talking about Jupiter, that what we really need to do is trust.
Yeah, Jupiter makes us play, or Jupiter encourages us to play. Saturn makes us work.
Saturn makes us work. So these gifts, when we have a transit in a certain area of our chart, in a certain area of our lives, that is, right? The houses or areas of our lives. Yeah. So when we have a transit there, are you saying that there's going to be more work, more, things get uncovered, and we actually have to take action on what we see?
Yes, generally speaking. Now, people can really decide to ignore Saturn. We can ignore our transits if we want to. I remember an old friend of mine from my teens, I don't know why he actually did it, but he came to me for a reading at one point, and he had just finished a Saturn transit that for many people can be really challenging. So I was saying to him, you might have been through a rough time. He said, no, I was fine. Well, as we talked a bit more, he basically had spent that entire transit under an alcoholic, drug-induced haze. And so, of course, he hadn't experienced anything. But what happened was he responded to the stress of that and just went underground. So we always have choice in terms of how we handle situations.
Yeah.
And if we switch for a moment to Pluto, Pluto's a very interesting transiting planet, because what Pluto does is Pluto intensifies things. If you just comprehend that that's what Pluto does, you can understand the entire effect of what goes on with a Pluto transit. So with Pluto, it will go into an area of our lives, into a certain house or aspecting a certain planet, and it will take everything that's in you in terms of that area of life, and make it 10 times bigger than it was before, just by intensifying what is existing there in your life, in your psyche, in your subconscious also, because Pluto in a way is sort of like Saturn on steroids. It's the most intense evolutionary piece. And so it's wonderful when it feels wonderful when it intensifies the positives, and it is wonderful when it intensifies the positives, but it's also in a sense wonderful when it intensifies the negatives, because we can easily get used to having certain negative situations, certain bad habits, certain responses. We don't really like them, but we're busy with other things. We don't even realize there might be a way to change them. When Pluto comes along and makes them 10 times bigger than they were before, we're running around screaming, going, I've got to do something.
Right.
So we learn how to transform it. We learn how to let it go. But even more importantly, what I learned after a while of really struggling with one of my Pluto transits is that in a sense, Pluto is almost like a trickster. He doesn't really mean to be a trickster, but because Pluto intensifies things, it not only intensifies that area of our lives, that facet of our charts, but it will also intensify whatever we focus our attention on. So once again, if we start focusing on, oh my God, Pluto's in my fill in the blank house, oh, it's doom, Pluto we start obsessing about the negative facets that we're experiencing or imagining. So it's really important to focus. If we focus on the positive, then there is there's a little bit of time required to build a bit of momentum, but then Pluto will intensify the positive.
That's a wonderful thing to know about how to engage with it. And a question came up for me as you were talking, which is, how about natally? We're talking transits, but what about Pluto, natal, its natal position? There's also, in this kind of realm of talking in a fear-based way about certain astrological elements, we even see things like someone looking at a chart for the first time and having a kind of expression of horror, or a real response to a reaction to seeing, oh, Pluto's in this house, or and that doesn't bode well. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's, of course, each individual chart is unique, and there's going to be a kind of a different message that Pluto is going to hold for each individual in terms of all the specific details of where it's situated.
Right.
But I mean, the Pluto in the sign is significant for a generation, and it's aware of it's a symbol of what we're subconsciously sensitive to, and what a whole generation is transforming and evolving collectively.
Yeah.
In the natal chart, Pluto's often a place where there's a lot of hidden power, actually.
Wow.
So just as a general rule, it's often an area of our lives that can stay quiet for long periods of time, but then burst forward with a tremendous amount of power. And so it's people who are very, very, very quiet and stay hidden for a long time, and they're a sudden fame, and they're in the limelight for several years, and then they disappear again. That's a Plutonian kind of situation. That's the kind of thing that may be more likely if somebody has, for example, Pluto in the 10th house. And
then some transit hits that house.
Right. Yeah. Or other things ripen in some other way in terms of the rest of the chart, and Pluto jumps forward, because it doesn't necessarily have to be that particular house triggered, interestingly enough, to bring it out.
Okay, right. So that makes me think, so you're saying that Pluto is a place of hidden mastery, so we can hidden power rather. I was going somewhere with that. There's a reason I made that Freudian slip. Hidden power, or that slip, so that it's a place of hidden power, and so we can engage with it that way. We can appreciate that aspect of it. And I want to go back to Saturn for a moment, because we didn't talk about the natal placement, and you teach that Saturn is also a place of hidden mastery.
Exactly. Yes. Again, that world card. Yeah. See, it's interesting because both Saturn and Pluto are shadow planets when you think about shadow in terms of the Jungian archetype of the shadow. So they both relate to our hidden strengths, our hidden powers, our hidden capabilities. And the things that we bury for whatever reason, and sometimes they're buried because of some conclusion we came to in a previous lifetime, and we come into this lifetime and all this stuff is sitting underneath the surface. Sometimes we bury them, or it appears that we bury them because of things that go on in our childhood. But because they're buried, they're scary. So then people naturally, or innocently, being at a certain stage of spiritual development, have a bit of a fear of these shadow planets, because these shadow planets are bringing the hidden things out, and we're scared that our hidden stuff is bad stuff.
Right. Something comes to mind. I've heard Stephen Forrest say this actually, that I thought was so beautiful and very relevant to our conversation, which is, these planets may have been seen as difficult, in the past, especially, with the example of Saturn, there's a difficulty about it. And the confusion may be around that difficult doesn't necessarily mean bad.
Exactly.
So,
I mean, if you're going to build a very large, intricate stone house, that takes work. You could look at that as being difficult. You could also look at that as being tremendously worthwhile.
Yes.
And it will take time, and you'll do things step at a time.
And that's what makes it lasting, right?
Yeah. With Jupiter, you just win the lottery and you can, the house drops in your lap. But
Right.
you don't get the satisfaction that you built it yourself.
Yes. And so you were talking about Pluto and how that area of our chart that Pluto is in natally can, that area of hidden power can sometimes blossom and come to the surface, and sort of manifest into the material world when, based on something else in our chart, something ripening or transit or something. So, and then you also said that it can kind of then dissipate, right? So the fame comes and then it goes. Yeah. It sounds like, does it not have that same kind of lasting quality that Saturn has? Can you talk about the quality?
No, not really, not in terms of that, but it's almost like, how would I explain it? There are certain animals that they have, because long lifespan, and then in a certain phase of their lifespan, they have this tremendous flowering, and then that's complete. Mm-hmm. So it's not that it's not lasting. In one sense, it would be too exhausting if it was your whole life long that this tremendous surge of power was active. Yes. And in another sense, it's something that needs to be done, and then it's complete. And again, now this is a general rule. Again, it's not going to apply in every single situation. Another thing Pluto can often refer to is obsessiveness, and a sense of some kind of karmic lesson we have. I think of Pluto in the second house. A lot of people have Pluto in the second house. There's a real intense karma around money. Right. And around fears about money, a grabby tendency with money, or push money away. And, I've seen people go through really extreme situations financially with Pluto in the second house. But again, that's not necessarily a guarantee. Some people might have it, and it sits there in the subconscious, and their conscious personality sorts the balance out without having to go through a lot of extreme situations.
Interesting. And do you see any pattern of why it would present one way or the other, evolutionarily speaking?
Well, if we get back to Mercury, it's consciousness. How conscious is the person?
Mm-hmm.
What is their attitude towards life? What is their focus? So again, it's so easy with astrology to be concerned, because astrology teaches us things we don't know, which is lovely. But there's a part of us that thinks, oh my God, there's things we don't know. What if?
Yes.
So is there some uncontrolled, horrible thing that's going to rear its head up suddenly and create havoc and destruction? And again, what do we need, and what are we creating, and what are we being responsible for, and what are we being conscious of in our lives? That's going to make a huge difference in terms of how we experience and express what's going on and what's going on in our charts.
Okay, so
twins can have a very different, they use their charts very differently. So a person who's not being conscious when they're using the same chart effectively as a whole, ends up over time having a whole different set of experiences than a person who's approaching their life really consciously.
Yes, absolutely.
This does bring to mind another thing that I wanted to talk about, which is aspects. So when we have transiting aspects, I mean, we're coming into the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, and we're going to have Jupiter come in and play with those guys in a little while too. But the Saturn-Pluto conjunction happens about once every 20 years, and so there was the Saturn-Pluto conjunction back in the early 80s, and I knew several people who had either the Saturn-Pluto conjunction conjuncting their sun or squaring their sun. And a Saturn-Pluto conjunction squaring the sun would traditionally be considered to be the really, really, oh my God, this is terrible, this is nasty, this is horrible. And in each situation with the people I watched, how this turned out was completely indicative of what spiritual level of development they had, how they approached their life, how much they were just curious about life and wanting to learn and wanting to be conscious. So from, a person who really wasn't being conscious at all in their lives just really did have all hell break loose. And then another person I knew who was really curious and looking at certain things had a lot of weird experiences happening that were really unusual. But then my best friend at the time went into who has a Mars Mercury conjunction, and generally people with Mars Mercury conjunction have such busy minds that they're really not very good at meditation. It's just going all the time. It's very challenging to meditate. And people who have Mars Mercury conjunctions, if they are like that, should not beat themselves up for not being good meditators. But given that, she had this aspect going on, and she went into a room and she went into a deep state of meditation for a week, and she came out completely transformed and glowing. So these two primarily transformative planets, Saturn and Pluto, were working completely on an inner level with her. There was no need for external upheaval. There was no need for external weirdness. There was this pure, almost like a laser beam of change.
Right. And
it really brought her, that's actually when she went into the third stage of her sign.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
So if folks are curious about the stages, they can find other videos, right?
Yeah, that's what the third stage astrology is about the 3 different stages of the sign.
Right. Right. So videos with you explaining that. So if we can we go back to the planets?
Yeah, absolutely.
For a moment. So so we went through Saturn, we talked about Pluto. Can we talk about Mars?
Yeah.
And you started, you talked a little bit about it with the Mercury-Mars conjunction. So yeah, let's dive into Mars.
Yeah. Well, Mars, Pluto is considered to be the higher octave of Mars. And so Mars is sort of the lower octave of Pluto, would be another way to look at it. So as the way that Pluto intensifies things, Mars tends to kind of inflame things, energizes things. Mars and the Sun, when they transit, they often are trigger points for the slower moving transits.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So, yeah, and again, Mars transit, we're not always going to notice Mars transiting for ourselves, but when other things are if there's already a lot of stress or change in motion, Mars can be the catalyst that burns the situation, turns the situation rapidly in another direction.
Right. And so,
it injects drive also, it injects inspiration and movement.
right? It mobilizes us, right?
Yes, that's perfect.
So Mars, that's a beautiful description of what it does in transit. And what about natally? I mean, there's so many different positions that we can have Mars in, and traditionally Mars is viewed as, the warrior archetype, and that can have, that can be a very beautiful expression, and also that can be, there can be understandably reasons to fear that, right? So how can we work with Mars consciously? How can we work with it, in a way that is respectful of the power there, but also can kind of keep us, I don't know if safe is the right word, but, honoring that there is destructive power there. Right?
Yeah. I mean, there could be destructive power there. One thing that's valuable about astrology is it focuses specific archetypes, and then we can answer philosophical questions about those archetypes and focus our understanding in terms of all of it. So Mars has to do with assertiveness, aggression, sexuality, male energy, with how our father acted when we were a child, his self-expression. And when we see Mars in our chart, we get an objective impression of how we started our lives in terms of our perspective towards that energy. So it gives us a sort of, Mars is not a particularly objective planet. It's feeling things, it's acting on things, it's expressing things.
Primal.
So chart, we've got something that's sitting on the table. That's a kind of mirror we can look into to get a sense of the balance point. So is our Mars quiet? Does that mean we need to assert ourselves more? Could we learn how to assert ourselves more? Is our Mars really being pummeled away at by some things that are very Martian? The different aspects are all related to specific planets. So a square has the nature of Mars. So if your Mars has got squares to it, it's going, if it has, if it's in a strong sign, then Mars is really intensified. What can we learn about that? If Mars is intensified and there's a rage in there, you can look at the chart and say, okay, where's this rage actually coming from? Because rage is a reaction to something. What is the original source of that feeling? You can trace it down through different parts of the chart. So you can utilize astrology to explore that part of yourself, or that part of ourselves.
Right. So you're using the aspects that way.
Yeah.
To find the origination point. And so that also makes me think about Mars, and also we can also apply this to the planets we've already talked about, and may talk about in the rest of the conversation, Pluto, Saturn, as well as Mars and others. What do you think about the planetary placements natally in, their signs where they're fallen or in detriment? So someone might look at their chart, for instance, and, oh my God, I have Mars in Cancer, or, right?
Yes.
So there might, right? There's that kind of a knee-jerk reaction in the collective consciousness in some ways as well. So what would you say about that? I know you have really interesting perspectives there.
Yeah, well, Mars in Cancer is in fall, but it's also in honor of triplicity. So that's interesting because it has some positive things traditionally being honor of triplicity, and then it's weakened when it's in fall. And if in Cancer has to do with our early childhood. So if we have anger issues coming from our early childhood, that is challenging, especially because our assertiveness may have been squashed a bit while we were younger too, if we were a grumpy kid. And they don't know where this grumpy kid came from, because that's a kind of a karmic pattern the person brought in. But and that's something, again, to learn from. We should never ever look at our chart and say, oh my God, I've got this, I'm doomed.
Right.
I've got this, it means this is the issue I started life with. But that's the
right. I think that's so key. Yes. What did you say? Say that again.
Clarity about where we started from and what it means and where it came from. Because if we know where it came from, a lot of times we can use that to unravel it. if we know what it means and what it really is, then we can understand what is the balance point that I want to aim for here.
So I think that's so key, what you just said, which is, and this has the potential to really turn the way that everybody, the way that we look at astrology on its head. So, you're saying that what the chart is, what I'm hearing, I'll say that, what I'm hearing is that the chart is really a description of where we're coming from, right? Where we're entering life, the predicament of the soul.
Yeah, and the goals of the soul and the purpose of the soul also. So
right.
It's got our chosen destiny and the baggage we brought with us. That's basically how you could describe the birth chart.
And what it's not showing is any kind of a prediction,
like a lasting,
exactly how things will unfold.
Right. Now, there's a few things that are that we really selected to be a destined experience or a destined situation. But
yes.
Even then, how that turns out is more archetypal than specific in a lot of cases.
Okay, so you mean we chose a certain kind of experience or a flavor of experience or an archetype,
yes.
But exactly how that will manifest is not predetermined.
That's right. So in other words, if we chose to have some kind of positive encounter with a romantic partner, we may have lined up our initial candidate and haven't made a soul agreement with that individual, but there's so much choice points along the way, and even when people encounter each other, that it may not turn out to have been one specific individual, but the basic experience is still going to be in place with whomever it shows up with. So that's one example.
Okay, this is great. It's really the more we dig in, the more it becomes clear just how responsible we are and need to be.
Yeah.
Right, as we really understand sort of what's going on at a soul level.
Yes.
And what astrology is teaching us, then we have no choice in some way but to take responsibility.
Yeah. Now, I remember in my other student, Sarah was asking me about, the difference between the chart and free will. And I said, well, the chart is free will. There's not a difference between them.
Yes.
But free will is also an interesting thing because we have so many different levels of our psyche. So which facet of our free will are we expressing in a given situation? Yeah. And if we get back to Saturn's transits and to a certain extent Pluto's transits, the facet of free will they are expressing is the higher self. And the higher self has a different perspective than the personality does. So sometimes it's like, oh my God, why is this going on in my life? Yeah. And then astrology helps us understand, okay, here's why. And here's what the lesson potential is of the situation. And then when we attend to the lesson of it, we get through the situation so much faster. Transforms it.
Yeah, right. And sometimes just that shift, the mindset shift can be the doorway that that allows us to keep going, right? Because we can feel stifled and stuck and under pressure if it's a Saturn, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Taina, I know you've also said, and I wonder if this feels relevant to you here, that as we mature as souls, right, as we evolve, then some of the quote unquote weaker planetary positions, in detriment and fall actually become, could you speak to that?
Thank you for reminding me of that. Yeah. I was going to say that about Mars and Cancer. Yes, because we're here to master all the archetypes, to master every facet of ourselves. So the reason why certain planets would be in fall and detriment is because when they're in that particular sign, the combination of that, you still there?
I'm here.
Okay, suddenly lost you for a second, it looked like, but anyway, the combination of that particular planet and sign and the ruler of that sign doesn't immediately mix easily, but as we master those archetypes, we create a much more detailed, thrilling, and exquisite expression of things. So in spiritual mastery, the planets that are in detriment and fall become tremendous strengths. I'll use an example of Mercury in Pisces, because Mercury in Pisces is in both detriment and fall. So Mercury is really, really bad situation.
Yes.
Put it in Pisces. It's like the rational mind has been thrown into the ocean and is drowning and freaking out. What happens most of the time with Mercury in Pisces is people with Mercury in Pisces tend to be really forgetful. They tend to fall into negative thought because...
What did you say? They tend to be...
Very forgetful.
Forgetful, yeah.
A friend of mine who has Mercury in Pisces has absolutely no sense of direction, which as a cyclist is challenging.
Yes.
Where am
I? They chose to challenge themselves.
Yes. Actually, that may have changed, because as we continue on, maybe that person's gotten over this situation. But the other thing is that Mercury is the rational mind, and Pisces is empathic and intuitive, and it's like a big sponge. So the rational mind is absorbing all the thoughts and feelings and emotions of everything around it, and it absorbs all the negative around it. And it also falls into negative thinking really easily. So we have a basically very confused person whose mind is so influenced by their emotions and by negative thinking and by everybody else's emotions and everybody else's negative thinking. Yes. It can create a mess. Yeah. However, if the rule in astrology is that all energies must express, but the form the energy takes in order to express has a broad spectrum.
Right.
So there's always a positive part of the spectrum that this energy can express as. And this is where we get the spiritual mastery piece of it, because if we're always keeping our spiritual balance and aiming for the higher expression of things, understanding that everything that we experience is an expression of pure energies that have a higher quality to them, then that's why more spiritually oriented people actually flourish and are happier under stressful, quote unquote, stressful transits than they are in their normal lives. They're happy in their normal lives, but they're ecstatic when they're challenged with a Saturn-Pluto conjunction squaring their sun. They're up on their surfboard on that high wave.
Right. So it's because they're taking that energy and transforming it.
Yes, yes. So if we think how the rational mind normally acts in a very separative way and cuts things up into little pieces and is, clear-cut and rational, that's a good thing. But if it can start to understand the intuitive levels of consciousness, when Mercury in Pisces is perfected, there's this high understanding of all kinds of subtle areas of life, subtle principles. There's a mystical spiritual focus. And the Mercury in Pisces person can surf around, when they're developed, they can surf around through all kinds of levels of understanding and perception and intuition and focus it and express it and write about it. And then we've got Mercury in Pisces working really well. And it also maintains its conscious understanding of the mass mind, instead of having the mass mind unconsciously leak into their brain and create all kinds of confusion. And then they're not forgetful anymore. It does take energy for a Mercury in Pisces person to focus, because the natural thing is to just melt out into the one. So that, and you don't know where you are anymore and you forgot what you were doing.
Right.
But once they get used to always utilizing that mental muscle, their mind becomes very strong. So this is where these apparently weaker positions are real keys to mastery.
So is it also just the, and I think I'm just kind of repeating it or clarifying it in a more simple way, but is it that any area where we really have to work, we actually end up mastering?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah. Okay. Those are often elements of our real destiny.
Right. I think of sometimes with astrology and Saturn and these areas of mastery that can feel so impossible when we're in the work or when we're gazing up at the work before us. Yes. I think about, the phenomenon of learning a second language, where it can feel so raw in the beginning, and it's really bringing out all of our vulnerabilities,
Yes.
speaking that language in front of other people, and we know we're getting things wrong, and it can just feel so raw. It can hit us at the most tender spots, and yet when we actually do perfect that language, often someone that's learned a language as a second language speaker will be actually much more nuanced and fluid in that language. Their vocabulary will be much more rich. Not in all cases, but if we really apply ourselves.
Yes, you're right.
So that gives me also a way of engaging with my Saturn and my more difficult placements.
Mm-hmm.
That's more empowered. Okay, so we've talked about Saturn, we've talked about Pluto, we've talked about Mars. Do you want to say anything about Uranus? Not necessarily that it's, considered negative in any way, but it can be destabilizing, right?
Yes, definitely can. Actually, I wish I remembered the name of this astrologer. I don't, but he was the astrologer who finally discovered what Uranus means. Because, a new planet is discovered, and astrologers spend a lot of time trying to figure out, what is this planet doing? What does it mean? What is its effect? So he finally figured out what Uranus meant when his house was burning down. He was actually all excited and running around going, yay, I finally know what this means while this house is in flames.
And he didn't know why yet?
No, nobody really knew what Uranus was. I mean, this was the first new planet. And if you think about just that as a metaphor of Uranus, it's so new that you didn't even know there was anything new.
You didn't know that new could be possible.
Exactly. So that's what Uranus is. That's what Uranus transit is. This is a possibility you didn't even know could happen, or that new was even possible. So sure, but Uranus is the future, and Uranus wants our freedom.
Yes.
And so we can be really secure in a situation, and we're putting up with a lot of stuff, but we just assume it's part of what life, it's part of what's necessary. And Uranus comes along and blows it all up.
That's right.
And it can make us want our freedom more. It does. And some, again, one thing that's really quite crucial in understanding transits is that they give us what we need. So sometimes a person could go through Uranus transit, and again, they don't really notice a whole lot because they're already free. They're already going towards the future. It's not a whole lot to be done.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes it's a big explosion because we were really clinging to stuff that we really should not have been clinging to.
Right.
And certainly to embrace the new, sometimes there's a big Uranus transit and you need to make giant changes and other people aren't comfortable with it and they're judging you. And it's just to understand that this is the right thing. This is new. This is life oriented, and it's going to be a benefit, overall benefit for all concerned one way or another.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So the big Uranus transit that comes to mind is the opposition.
Mm-hmm.
Right, the midlife.
Yeah, yes, that's a
crisis.
Yeah, that's an interesting one because it happens at a really interesting age. It happens when we are as wise as we're going to be while we're still pretty strong physically. So we've got the strengths of youth and the strengths of age at the same time then. So we're as strong as we're going to possibly be in a lifetime in terms of all the bodies. So that's the point in time where this desire for real true freedom, real true expression of self, because Uranus wants us to be true to ourselves, comes into play very strongly.
Yes.
So limitations in a way, we never could before and might not be able to after to the same degree.
Right. And so there's a sense of, it's interesting, I think.
And just in case people don't know, this aspect that Katya's talking about happens to everybody at about the age 42, give or take.
Yes, thank you. And how long does it last?
Well, usually about a year.
Okay. So I find it culturally interesting that, at least in the culture that I find myself, the water that I'm swimming in, the United States, I imagine there's some similarity to other Western cultures that there's this whole kind of idea of a midlife crisis, whereas, the Uranus opposition is actually teaching us that it's a time when we have the invitation to go toward what is really true for us. And maybe it's showing us, the job that I chose is not really true to myself. This other thing I chose is not really true to me. And of course,
driving is not really true to me.
Yeah, right. Hopefully it's just your car. That's what I wish for everyone. It's just your car that you're driving that's not true to you. No, but really, and at the same time, we have the physical stamina, we have the strength to actually make changes and align our life. Not that we can't do it later, but that we're still in a place of power, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting that midlife crisis is something that is made fun of, and there's so many people saying, "Oh, he or she is in their midlife crisis," as though it's a time when people just go crazy.
Yeah,
don't make any sense.
Right.
Now, Uranus is associated with eccentricity and with nonconformity, and can be looked at as crazy, and other people don't relate to it. And when we're in a Uranus transit, a lot of the time, there are going to be a lot of people, if we're suddenly really inflamed by it and affected by it, there are going to be a lot of people who are going to say, you've gone nuts.
Right. And do you think that we are more inflamed by it if in the past we've sort of looked away from the messages from our soul or our true self saying, this isn't really aligned? Like, will Uranus really come in and, be more of a disturbing, destabilizing force in that?
Yes, I would say so.
Okay, so this is really making me think of that kind of principle in Aikido of working with energies rather than against them, right? So when our transit comes, if we go with that energy, then it's a very different experience from resisting or cowering.
Absolutely. Yep. And it makes life so much fun.
Yes, absolutely. That's my favorite part of astrology, Taina.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, do you want to say anything about the South Node, Ketu?
Oh, yeah, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. What's interesting about the North Node and the South Node, or in the Vedic or Jyotish tradition, it's Rahu and Ketu, is that in the Vedic tradition, they're both considered to be malefics, Rahu and Ketu. Now, in the general Western tradition, the North Node is generally considered to be a benefic, and the South Node is generally considered to be a malefic.
In the Western tradition?
In the Western tradition, yes, as a general rule. Now, that's quite interesting because it shows you how it's culturally affected or culturally connected in a sense, because the North Node, or Rahu, is about self-actualization, which is idealized in the West. So considered to be benefic.
Yes.
Rahu, about self-actualization in traditional Vedic culture, traditional Indian society, you're not supposed to self-actualize really to the extent that your soul might be longing for.
Yes.
So it's disruptive, and it feels like you've got too big an ego. You got too big for your britches. That's the basic meaning of Rahu.
Right. And you're going to break out of the societal norms, and you can disturb the, all of the sort of harmony. Yeah.
Yeah. In Jyotish, Rahu rules Aquarius, which again is the sign that is about breaking the norms and being the unusual, futuristic sort of person. So that's fascinating.
And Rahu is the North Node.
Yes, that's right. Rahu's the North Node. So North Node in I guess karmic astrology, the North Node represents our positive future spiritual direction, and the South Node represents where we've come from. So it can be a container in which our baggage is being carried around in, for sure. And but again, just like my metaphor for when you're looking at Mars in your chart, Mars is going to say where you began your lifetime in terms of your perspective to assertive energies and anger and sexuality and, initiative. both, you know, the
All
quote
those Martian things, yeah.
So the South Node really talks about, well, what is your karmic history? What is your past history? It's not the only part of the chart that shows it, but it is also a part that still is in reaction to the past.
Yes.
And so then we can learn from what is going on instead of going on automatic pilot and reacting in that way. If we remember, oh, right, this is my South Node right now. This is an old thing that I don't need to live in anymore. It helps us to pull out of it. But also at a lot of times there are old gems from the past that the South Node also talks about. So it's interesting because with Saturn in our birth chart, we've got our fears and insecurities that we're born with, and once we sort through them, we get that strength and that mastery that was always hidden away in there. So South Node is, in a sense, is our past masteries.
Mm-hmm. Right. And we don't want to just throw them away, right? We don't want to completely dissociate. Like, I don't know that side of me anymore, because it's carrying a gift. Yeah.
Now, in the Jyotish astrology, Ketu is, they consider the North and South Node as planets, and Ketu is considered to be a planet of spiritual liberation. So if you tie that perspective of spiritual liberation to those gems of our past, it's all a piece of that eternal soul.
Okay, can you say more about how it's the planet of spiritual liberation?
Well, from the Vedic perspective, Ketu transits and a Ketu Mahadasha, which is, the Mahadashas are these long-term planetary periods that everybody passes through.
Right. Yes.
More people during their Ketu Mahadasha really go towards spiritual understanding. They have a lot of things, material things taken away from them. It's the time when more people start studying Vedic astrology. I actually did start studying it more intensely when I was in my Ketu Mahadasha, but I did not have material things taken away because my whole life has been about spiritual things. It was more that some of my spiritual things were taken away. It's very interesting.
Why do you think that happened?
Well, I think probably because to a degree it was about balancing me.
Right.
I did start developing some other spiritual studies that I had been wanting to do for years. And so some of my other avenues were kind of taken away. And it did balance me because I needed to have more of a material foundation in my life, and I didn't have that. But it felt very much like I was, what's the word for it? Not banished from my real life, but something similar to that. I'm taken away from where I really want to be.
And so, okay. Did you feel like you resonated with that, that Jyotish sort of perspective of it being the planet of spiritual liberation? Did you feel it in for yourself?
I can understand how that is seen to be that way, but I didn't have that impact on me. I think because that's how I'd been living my life. Just like if somebody goes through a Uranus transit, they're already free. The Uranus isn't really going to free them any more than they already are. Uranus says, "Oh, good, hi, you're doing great.
Yes,
you can go talk to someone else now."
Right, that makes sense. Okay, so and I love that. And one thing I've also heard about Rahu and Ketu, or the North Node and the South Node, that I'm not sure I've shared with you, Taina, with the, so it's seen as a dragon, right? The myth is the traditional dragon that was cut in half.
Yes, a demon, actually.
A demon, okay.
It's a demon that tried to steal the elixir of immortality from the gods.
Yes. Right, and got punished.
Yeah, my guy being beheaded.
So there's the head of the dragon, which is our North Node, or positive spiritual direction, in the Western astrology. And then there's Ketu, or the South Node, which is the dragon's tail. And, I love the sort of metaphor of the dragon's tail is where the excretion is. That's what we're excreting.
Yeah.
And it's like we're walking through the world, and we can't possibly ever expect ourselves to be nourished with that, with our own excrement, essentially. Sorry to be.
That's a very good way to put it, yes.
And yet it does serve as a fertilizer for others and for,
Yes.
Oh, right. So I
Yes.
love that. And then I've also heard that with Rahu, or the North Node, one of the reasons that the Jyotish, or Vedic astrologers, see it as malefic is that it can sort of become, manic, or like greedy and overly hungry.
Yes. Yeah, that is what they see. And yeah, I can, because the thing is, I think the reason it could do that is if we're not spiritually focused, then our personality is distant from the actual goal, but becomes
Right.
still hungry for it. Because we're all here for spiritual evolution, whether we're consciously aware of it or not. So this is also why spiritual figures can get persecuted, because people are so envious. You've got something I don't have.
Yes.
So the Rahu, when it becomes negative, it's hungry for something that's not real. And that's where the original metaphor of the demon that was trying to steal the elixir of immortality from the gods comes from. The demon is not divine. It's that part of us that is not divine yet. Or, if you want to get more complex, in the West, the demons were the old gods that were demoted. They really are spiritual, but everybody said they weren't. So that's another interesting little wrinkle.
Interesting. Well, that confuses things. I've got a whole other layer to go home and contemplate now, Taina. You're going to be hearing from me on that one. Okay, just a few more questions.
Sure. We need to wrap this up pretty soon. It's getting long.
Let's do it. But one, is there anything that you want to say about fixed stars? Some of them are like, oh my God, if you have your sun on Algol, like, watch out. Is there anything about that?
Well, it's something that I've there's things you run into that you glance at and look at a certain amount. And that's how I've been with fixed stars.
Yep.
So I don't have a lot of personal experience or a lot of data to go on. In general, when I find that to be the case, it usually shows that it's certainly not a big thing to be frightened of. There is an archetype there to consider, but once again, are we using it consciously or not? That's probably the real question.
Right. And I know a lot of these fixed stars are also, tied up with myth, like, right? I mean, it's all about the myth, and it's all about, this is the head of Medusa, and this is the story. Yeah. How much of that is, like, as you were saying earlier, the cultural belief that has, we've imbued.
A lot of times there is a really good symbolic spiritual metaphor there. So you want to look at what's the deeper meaning of that metaphor? What's the deeper meaning of that myth? Yes. Because myths teach enduring truths through stories.
Yes. Okay. And, gosh, I think we've done it, Taina. I think we've done it all.
Yeah.
Of course, we'll remember something in the middle of the night tonight.
Of course.
That can be a follow-up recording.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much. What's that?
The long one and then the short one.
That's right. The addendum.
Yes. Okay.
To come, perhaps. Yes. All right, everybody.
Talk to you later.
Thanks for joining us. Yes.